Hi, I'm Ronnie Meek, and this is the Unbeliever's Bible Study, Session 21, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. If you've been following along, you know that after the death of Solomon, the nation of Israel split into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom went into captivity some 200 years later. They were taken there by the Assyrians, and there is no official record of a return from captivity, though obviously some of them did. About 150 years later, Judah, the southern kingdom, went into captivity. Babylonians took them into captivity. Babylon itself fell in 539 BC, and Cyrus the Great, the Persian leader, decreed that deported peoples could return home. Not just the Jews, all of them could. Over 42,000 Jews returned, and there is a record of this, and the temple was rebuilt. Some 80 years later, Ezra came to Jerusalem, and about 12 years later, in 445 BC, Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem and rebuilds the walls of the city. Many did not return, including Esther. And so that kind of covers the three books that we're looking at today. The first is Ezra. The book of Ezra has the most confusing timeline of any book in the Bible. Chapters 1 through 6 cover a period of approximately 538 BC to 515 BC, except for a couple of letters in chapter 4, which are referenced and which were written actually some 60 or 70 years later. And then in chapter 7, it jumps to 458 BC without any reference whatsoever to the intervening years. Ezra was a priest and a scribe, and he first records the return of a large delegation. I mentioned earlier, he puts the delegation at 42,360 people in 538 BC. They were led by the priest Zerubbabel. They also brought along 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. Ezra was a record keeper. The first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra take place during the rebuilding of the temple, and much of the book records the facts about this rebuilding project. The temple was started in 538 BC, but not completed until 516 BC because of opposition. Ezra records the opposition to this project. Peoples from the surrounding area offered to help with the project, but they were refused because they were excluded from worshiping the Lord. And these people then set about to hinder the rebuilding, but were foiled in their efforts. Finally, Ezra himself comes to Jerusalem, leading a sizable delegation for the purpose of restoring religious life and enforcing the law of Moses. So I don't know if you noticed, but those first 6 chapters, Ezra doesn't say anything about it, but he wasn't there. He didn't come until some 70 years later. Nehemiah is not my favorite character in the Bible. He seems a little too concerned with what we used to call tooting his own horn, and is too legalistic for my taste. Still, it probably required a man such as him to do what needed to be done, and he also possessed some very admirable qualities. He hears about the situation in Jerusalem at the beginning of the book, and how the walls have not rebuilt, and the city is in shame, basically. And praying to God that he would find favor, he does find favor with the king, who sends him to Jerusalem to restore its walls and gates. And upon his arrival, he motivates the people to rebuild the walls. He faces opposition in the form of compromise and political intrigue, but he refuses to compromise and to be intimidated by threats, with the result that the walls are rebuilt in 52 days. It's a pretty astounding feat. One of the things that I admire about Nehemiah is his concern for the poor. He hears complaints from the poor about them having to mortgage everything that they have with interest, and even have their children sold off into slavery to pay back debts. And Nehemiah requires the wealthy to stop charging interest and repay the interest they had already collected. He was a wealthy man himself, but he refused to further enrich himself at the expense of exploiting the poor. And you may say, well, that's pretty easy. Well, it may be pretty easy, but most rich people don't do that. His religious reforms were carried out with the help of Ezra. He restored the means of supporting the ministry of the priest at the temple. He also required that those who had married foreign women must divorce their wives and leave their children. And this is where I have a little bit of a problem with him. Moses had given laws about intermarriage with the nations around them when they first entered Canaan. I'm not sure those laws still applied to a strict prohibition, and certainly there were exceptions. The prostitute Rahab, who lived in Jericho. Ruth was a Moabite. I'm sure there were other exceptions. There had been good reason to not allow marriage to those who worship foreign gods. But now this standard ignored the fact that both he and Ezra were provided the opportunity to do the work they were doing because of a mixed marriage. And that brings us to Esther. Esther was a young Jewish girl who was brought up by her uncle Mordecai in Persia. Some people returned when they were allowed to return. Some stayed in Babylon. The prophet Daniel is one who stayed in Babylon. Some went to other places, including Persia. And Mordecai and his niece, whom he was raising, Esther, went to Susa, the capital of Persia. The story starts out with Queen Vashti being deposed. And after a search was made, she was replaced by Hadassah, who was also known as Esther. Political tension is set up by conflict between a man named Haman and Mordecai. Haman is a high official, in fact, the highest official, but Mordecai had no respect for him because he hated the Jews, and also he was disturbed by Mordecai's lack of respect for Haman. Haman apparently had a very high opinion of himself. And Haman devised a plot to destroy all the Jews. And so on the 13th day of the first month, a royal decree was issued that on the 13th day of the 12th month, people were allowed to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day. Well, clearly this caused no small amount of distress among the Jews, and Esther was informed of this by Mordecai. He came to the gate of the palace, wailing loudly in sackcloth and ashes. And Mordecai, Esther sent some clothes to him to wear instead of the sackcloth, and said, you really shouldn't be doing this. And Mordecai employed Esther, though, to appeal to the king. She apparently had not been aware of this decree that had been issued. Mordecai made her aware. Esther, though, was reluctant to go to the king because if anyone entered the king's presence without being summoned, they were put to death, unless the king himself extended to them his gold scepter. It had been a month since Esther had been summoned. To this, Mordecai informed her that if this was unchanged, she herself would not escape, and suggested that perhaps she had become queen exactly for such a time as this. She agreed and asked that all fast for 3 days, and then she would go before the king. And she said the famous words, "If I perish, I perish." Well, she goes to the king, and the king extends his royal golden scepter, and he asks her request. And Esther proves herself to be crazy wily. She asks for the king to come to a banquet she has prepared that day. Oh, and bring Haman with you. At the banquet, the king again asked, "What is your request?" She asked for the king and Haman to come again the next day to her banquet. They agree, and they all go away. And as Haman is going home, thrilled to be in the inner circle, he's furious because he sees Mordecai, who would not show him honor. He is advised by his friends to build a scaffold on which to hang Mordecai and go to the king the next morning to request Mordecai's execution. He thinks this is a good idea, so he puts it into motion. Earlier, we are told that Mordecai had uncovered a plot to kill the king, and the plotters were killed, and the plot foiled, and that seemed to be the end of the matter. But this very night, the king could not sleep, and the chronicles were brought to him to be read, and he read about this incident and asked what had been done for Mordecai. Well, nothing's been done for him. At that moment, Haman entered the palace to request Mordecai's execution. But before he can ask, the king has a question for him. What should be done for a man the king wishes to honor? And thinking that the king must be talking about himself, Haman replies, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse that the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. And then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on his horse through the streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Well, the king likes this suggestion, and he commands Haman to do that very thing for Mordecai. Well, Mordecai obviously is honored. Haman, on the other hand, seems to forget what he came to ask, which was Mordecai's execution. He goes home humiliated after he's carried out the king's command, and before he can get himself together, they come to take him to the banquet that day. And the king again asks Esther what she wants, and she tells him, "I don't want to be killed along with all of my people and my family." "Well, who would do such a thing?" the king asked. "This vile Haman," she says. Well, things went downhill quickly for Haman, with the result that he was hung on the same scaffold he had built for Mordecai. The results, Mordecai was elevated to the highest position, which had formerly been held by Haman. A new decree was issued that on the 13th day of the 12th month, the Jews could defend themselves and destroy their enemies. And since Mordecai's hand was on the scales, the balance shifted heavily in the Jews' favor. Ultimately, they were also allowed the same right on the 14th as well. And today, the Jews still celebrate this event by the celebration of Purim. Also, these events took place during the time that Ezra and Nehemiah were granted permission by the king to return to Jerusalem. Next time, we will look at the oldest book in the Bible. It's also one many claim to be their favorite. It's the book of Job. I hope you will join me.